And let's talk about rapidly sizing a backlog. Okay. My agenda, we're going to talk about what a backlog is, just really briefly. And we'll talk about why we have to size a backlog. We'll talk about estimating accuracy. We'll talk about affinity sizing, what it is, what the benefits are, kind of what the basic steps are. And then I'll walk you through 2 different methods for actually performing a backlog sizing using affinity sizing sort of session. All right, so first of all, all of us are probably familiar with this, right? So a backlog is a prioritized features list, right? Containing short descriptions of all the functionality desired. Basically it's features, it's bugs, it's technical work, it's, desires for knowledge acquisition. But for planning purposes, we need a prioritized backlog, right? That is the sort of the prerequisite, is that the product owner should be prioritizing that backlog, and as a Scrum Master, you should be working behind the scenes with them to groom and make sure that that happens. I've found that at some companies, this is one of the hardest things to obtain because it really requires the product owner or project manager to choose and be accountable for that choice about what the team's actually going to work on and what they may or may not accomplish. So this is something that you need to think through before actually trying to size a backlog. Why do we size a backlog? It enables product level planning, right? It allows you to work out a roadmap and release plans, and it allows you to work with other parts of the organization, to coordinate activities. You may have, advertising and marketing going on. You may be cross-coordinating, your project may be just one part of a larger project. There may be other release concerns that, may impact when you're able to actually distribute the products that you're building, etc. So, it allows for that cross-functional orchestration. It enables release level planning, where you figure out scope for the various releases and your timing and maybe your themes, right? It allows the product owner to make prioritization trade-offs. When I was working with Dave on something, and even he pointed out that it would be easy, it would be helpful if he was able to to know whether or not one thing was had a heavy price to it, or if he could get 3 other things for that price, he'd probably make a different decision about whether or not that was the most important thing. So making prioritization trade-offs, making ROI trade-offs, that sort of thing is all facilitated by having some idea of how big something is. Okay. The problem with that, let's talk about estimation accuracy, right? A lot has been written about estimation, okay? And over the years, I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly experienced a whole bunch of different models for estimating. Function points, lines of code, working hours, points, etc. The reality is that they are estimates, which means they have a certain level of accuracy, and that they are potentially wrong for many different reasons. And frankly, you won't really know how long something takes until you've actually done it, right? That being said, there is utility to doing estimation, as long as it's understood that there's potential for change as you learn from doing. I mentioned working with a whole bunch of different models. There's some commonalities to them all in terms of accuracy, and that's represented by this chart that I've got here. Basically, a little bit of effort doing estimation is worth a lot, right? And this is one of this is one of the things that we do with Agile, is we try to keep we build estimates, we use them, but we try to keep the level of effort involved in creating those estimations relatively low, because we expect that our priorities are going to change, and the things that we're doing are going to, we're going to iterate, we're going to learn from them. So those estimates have, a limited life in terms of their accuracy, and a limited utility because of their accuracy, right? So a little effort helps a lot. A lot of effort only helps a little. So, you can spend a lot of time trying to work on estimates, and that may be time better spent working on code, right? That's always, that's one of the things I've run into over the years, is like spending a lot of time trying to really build a very accurate estimate, is not necessarily worth the effort involved in doing so. right? And basically, again, there's unknowns. There's some level of uncertainty that any estimate has, and there's less return on the effort to build those estimates if you're trying to get them, entirely accurate. Because you're not there, there's always some level of uncertainty, and you're not going to be able to avoid that. That doesn't mean you should ignore it, right? You gotta be aware that there's uncertainty. You must account for it in some way, right? Either through buffers or using Fibonacci points, right? Using the Fibonacci series to build some buffers into your estimates, right? You can't ignore that uncertainty either, but estimations are only so accurate, and you want to limit the amount of time you spend building them, time that could be spent building product. Okay. So what is affinity estimating anyway? Affinity, right? Affinity estimating or relative estimating is a technique that Agile teams use to quickly and easily estimate a large number of stories into story points, right? The idea, put simply, is that you're estimating stories in relation to one another, okay? And relative estimation is kind of a big mind shift for a lot of developers who have been doing estimates for years and frankly, being repeatedly punished for that guessing wrong, right? It's a great technique if you're starting a project and have a backlog that hasn't been estimated yet, or you're preparing for release planning, right? This is what I was anticipating walking into at Fannie, was this idea that, from the interviews, I gathered that the project hadn't really been fully planned. People didn't really know how big it was. There were deadlines. Nobody knew if it could fit. They were trying to do project planning, but they didn't estimate the work yet. So, I mean, there was clearly a need to be able to get some numbers against the backlog just to try to understand gross sizing, right? I'll tell you that this technique's not for everybody, right? If you have an established Scrum team that, understands its velocity and, is highly productive and can estimate well, then maybe you don't want to change your technique, right? Don't fix what's not broken. But this is a technique that can offer benefits for a lot of different organizations. And like I said, I was anticipating the need, and I think Ugo's run into the same thing. So what are the benefits around affinity estimating? It's fast, okay? You can rapidly size a relatively large backlog. It's actually recommended for situations where you have more than 20 stories. If you have fewer than that, you should just use planning poker and go through them individually. But if you have a large number of stories, this is a good way of rapidly coming to an estimation that is useful for the trade-offs. It highlights assumptions and misinterpretations by exception. It promotes transparency and collaboration. It's very visual. Everyone's involved. Everyone has an opportunity to affect the estimate, right? It reduces confrontation. One of the things we do is we start with a silent relative sizing. I'll get into the basic steps here in a second, but the nature of the way that this is conducted actually reduces confrontation and keeps the process moving forward. And then finally, it's also easily facilitated, which is another good thing, right? As a Scrum Master, you have this nice little tool in your back pocket that's relatively easy to get the team to do. All right, so what are the basic steps? You start with grooming as a prerequisite, right? We got to have things prioritized. We're going to do a silent relative sizing, and I'll walk you through what all these things mean. We'll take an editing step at that after having done a relative sizing, and then we do grouping and pointing, and then there's a product owner challenge. So those are kind of the basic steps of the process. All right. So let me walk you through a couple methods of actually doing this in practice. Okay. For this first one, where you're actually, this is the more formal way of doing this. There's preparation, right? For the Scrum Master, you've got to groom the backlog. You should have your definition of done, right? Because obviously, definition of done impacts the amount of work that you have to do to complete every story. So if you don't understand that, it's tough to estimate the story. You want to determine a sizing model. You're either going to use t-shirt sizing or Fibonacci points, right? Fibonacci series based points, sorry. You'll want to, split large or complex stories, right? There's going to, you may end up at the end of the exercise, you may end up with some stories that haven't been sized. You'll have to deal with those. If you know of large stories in advance, you can go through and make them small enough that the team can actually consume them. That's a good idea. Um, where there's some things you want to do to enable collaboration, right? You want to provide the backlog to people beforehand. You want to, facilitate any discussions about some of these really large stories amongst the team or the product owners. You'll want to have your stories printed out, either on cards or whatever, right? And if there's acceptance criteria, you want those as well, right? You'll need supplies. You're going to be doing this on a wall, so you'll need some tape. You might need some markers and stickies, and you'll need your cards. Schedule a space that's got room for people to work, right? Everybody on the team should be there and participating, so they're going to be working the entire backlog against the wall, so you need probably a large space. And then you probably need to tell people what relative sizing it really means, just like the brief discussion that we've had. I think you can introduce it up front if you're actually walking them through the exercise, but it's a good idea to let people know what's going on before they have to do it. So the first step is silent relative sizing, okay? And the idea here is that you're gonna this is fun. You're gonna prepare the wall. You're gonna set up a scale that just indicates what where smaller items should go and where larger items should go. And the idea is that people you divvy up the cards. You just pass them out to the team members, okay? And they go up and one at a time they put up a card, and basically they put the card in relation to the stories that are up there. They put them whether it's bigger or smaller than the stories that are up there. So there'll be some shuffling of cards and whatever, but you time box this. You have the team go up and put up all their cards. There's no talking. Okay, I mean basically, each person has a handful of cards. They go up and put them where they think in terms of size, whether they're smaller or bigger, and try to space them between cards. And basically, you're doing your best guess as to whether it's bigger or smaller than the cards that are already on the wall. And in this way, you distribute. The goal is to distribute all your cards and have them placed where smallest to largest, right? Just like if you're lining people up, you're saying, hey, the shortest to the tallest, get yourselves in line, right? That's a relative sizing, okay? Things that you don't know, things that are too big that people are, maybe the story is too ambiguous. Parking lot it. You can have a conversation during the PO challenge for that. But the goal is to get all of the backlog on the wall sorted in size, okay? And this, you want to time box it at like half an hour, okay? Then you take an editing cycle, okay? The team is able to read the items on the wall. The Scrum Master probably facilitates this, and they refine the placement, right? Maybe some discussions happen about design, right? But basically, it's an opportunity to edit what other team members have put in place. And there may be some discussions, maybe some questions to the product owner. Again, you want to time box this, right? You want to run this until basically kind of everybody is comfortable with, where the stories are placed in relation to one another, okay? Then we group them and size them into buckets, right? You put up size cards, T-shirt sizes or Fibonacci point sizes, and you put up blue tape, right? You separate it into columns, and you have the team, do a sorting. Okay, the idea is to group them into these relatively sized buckets. Okay, and you'll see what we do with this next. So I mean, basically, this is where you're splitting them into small, medium, and large, or potentially putting points against them, right? And this is where you're coming up with how you're grouping these grouping the stories. If you're using T-shirt sizing, you will put points to them later, right? Using Fibonacci, you'll start with the extra small and make it a 1, right? And make the small a 2 and the medium a 3 or a 5, et cetera, right? You'll get the team to have a discussion about it. You may subcategorize one or two of your buckets, but the idea is that once you've got them grouped by relative size, then you assign points to them and you're done. Okay. The product owner challenge, basically after you've grouped it by size, you've got these groupings of the stories. The product owner may have questions, may have items that they want to talk about with the team. So you allow the team and product owner to have a discussion about specific stories that have been grouped. Okay. Again, the idea should be try to keep it fairly light, try to not be confrontational, right? You want to focus on, the reasoning for why they've been sized the way they are, all right? But this gives the product owner an opportunity to talk with the team about why they've sized things the way they have, okay? I've got some tips for success here. Again, this is a really good method for backlogs that have greater than 20 items, okay? Some product backlog items aren't well enough defined to be understood. Those should be parking lotted. That's something that you can potentially have discussions with your product owner about, is stories that need more refinement so that the team can size them. Don't put any sizing until you've done all the relative work in terms of getting them ordered from smallest to largest, and then doing some bucketing, right? Doing the edit process where everybody gets an opportunity to go back through them again. Again, you want to decide your sizing model before you start, right? You want to, the product owner challenge has to be facilitated so that you don't end up disrespecting the team in terms of their estimates. The Scrum Master really has to kind of facilitate this carefully so that you're both able to be efficient, and you respect everybody's opinions, and you get a successful outcome at the end. You're still going to end up doing obviously estimate refinements through your backlog grooming and through your sprint planning sessions, but this is just an exercise to get gross sizings in place so that release plans and ROI sort of trade-off discussions can happen. Okay. I've got a variation on a theme here. This is a similar way of doing this. This is called swim lane sizing. So there's a bunch of different ways of accomplishing this affinity sizing, but these are like the two most popular methods that I was able to find, right? Again, preparation, you want a groomed backlog. You want a definition of done, right? All the same ideas here. This exercise is actually done on a table as opposed to on a wall. And the idea is that you set up a grid, okay, where you've got swim lanes set up. You want 8 swim lanes, okay? No headers, right? It's just a grid that you set up on a big table. Like before, you divide up the backlog team cards amongst the team. You give them a few minutes to place their stories into a swim lane. Again, you're thinking in terms of sizing them smaller to larger. It's just like you're combining the steps of lining them up smaller to larger and putting them into buckets. So you'll end up they have 8 categories to put them in. They're already subdividing them into groups by swim lane. Okay. Again, this is a silent assignment, right? No discussion at this point. You have a refinement. Okay, this is that same idea where you have an editing where basically stories can be moved. If they are moved, there should be a discussion at that point. So anytime that somebody moves a story that somebody else assigned, there potentially should be some facilitated conversation about those kinds of moves. Okay. You ask the team about their confidence level in the relative sizing, right? The idea is you kind of go through the team, make sure everybody's comfortable with how the stories lined up in terms of, are these things, fairly similar in terms of their size based in terms of stories that are all in that group, right? So you want to give people an opportunity to have a discussion about potentially moving moving stories. You want people to all be fairly comfortable with the groupings that have happened. And at this point, you apply your sizing scale across the top, right? Again, you can play t-shirt sizes, but at this point, you might as well use your Fibonacci series and drop them in there. Label them 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, just like you normally would. Again, you've kind of got a parking lot for things that are really big, and then you've got your backlogs sized, and you're ready to have a PO challenge, and that's it. So the silent sorting finally is very powerful agile practice, right? The idea is that it's quick, it's efficient, right? You try to pull some of the debate out of the equation. This can be you can size a relatively large backlog in a couple hours. I've seen teams struggle with fewer stories and take longer at it. Here's some other rules of thumb you might use. A 5 is sort of a typical medium. Anything bigger than, teams will set up rules in terms of the largest story that they can have. So if you have stories that exceed that limit, you'll want to split them. Okay. Lastly, you want to make sure that you don't lose this information. Take pictures, right sizing on the items, make sure and get them into some sort of management tool, whether it's Jira or version 1 or something like that. You want to make sure that this information is not lost. You want to get it into a form that can be shared by people outside the team, right? I'm thinking in terms of your product owners and Scrum Masters and anyone in a sort of program management sort of a role. Any questions? This one was really short. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Well, that's all I had for you guys today. I hope that that you've enjoyed this and maybe you get an opportunity to put it to use on your projects. I'm going to stop the recording.